Hey guys, tonight we begin with something the medieval world absolutely excelled at: paranoia. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were a medieval king, the safest thing you could eat was nothing truly. Because the royal kitchen wasn't a kitchen. It was a medieval hazard zone where every pot, pan, and smiling servant represented a different potential homicide attempt. The cooks weren't just making meals. They were unintentionally, and occasionally intentionally, conducting daily biochemical warfare. Picture it. You walk into your kitchen as the most powerful man in the kingdom, and immediately you're greeted by the soothing aromas of boiling meat, burnt bread, and that one fish that should have been buried months ago. The head cook swears it's fresh, which is medieval for, "We scrape the flies off." And that's before the conspiracies even start. To protect themselves, kings employed tasters, a prestigious title that sounds noble until you realize it translates to, "Please ingest this mystery stew and let me know if it kills you." It's the only job where surviving lunch counts as a promotion. These tasters would bravely sample every dish. If they survived, the king ate. If they didn't survive, the king ordered takeout. Takeout meaning more soup, but from the other cook who looks less murdery. But here's the shocking truth. Medieval rulers weren't being dramatic. Poisoning was practically a national pastime. Why bother overthrowing a throne through war, marching armies, spending money, sweating, when you could just sprinkle something suspicious into the royal porridge? Take King John of England. Chroniclers insist he poisoned at least one rival, which honestly checks out. The man was petty enough to lose the crown jewels in a swamp, so poisoning a relative was probably just another Wednesday. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, turned assassination by food into a competitive sport. Courtiers exchanged poisons the way modern kids exchange Pokemon cards. Some emperors didn't even bother ruling. They just waited for dinner, dramatically clutched their stomachs, and let the next cousin take over. Even the papal kitchens weren't safe. More than one cardinal conveniently dropped dead right before an election. Chroniclers blamed the will of God, which is medieval for, "Please do not ask questions about what is floating in the wine." So yes, kings were paranoid. But honestly, not paranoid enough. Every royal meal was a conspiracy theory waiting for confirmation. Every bowl was a threat, every spoonful a cliffhanger. In medieval Europe, survival wasn't about courage, or strength, or divine blessing. It was about having a taster who really loved you. Medieval Europe had two great fears: anything that moved in the woods after dark, anything that moved in the woods after dark while singing. Which leads us directly to the era's juiciest conspiracy theory. Secret pagan cults hiding in the forests, practicing forbidden rituals under the moonlight, probably barefoot and definitely unwashed. Villagers swore these groups existed. The church swore these groups existed. Local cats probably swore these groups existed. And unfortunately for the Middle Ages, this conspiracy was absolutely true. But before you imagine robed sorcerers summoning demons, picture something far more historically accurate. A handful of exhausted peasants sneaking into the forest to chant old songs, burn herbs, and desperately hope the crops stop failing. Medieval life was stressful. You spent half the year starving, and the other half trying not to die from weather. If lighting a candle in the woods and whispering to the old spirits brought comfort, people were going to do it. And they did. These groups weren't sinister. They were more like illegal support groups with slightly better incense. But the church saw things differently. Anything not stamped approved by Rome was automatically a satanic plot. Enter the forest cult hunters. Priests who marched into the woods armed with torches, holy water, and absolutely zero survival skills. Usually they tripped over a root, screamed at an owl, and went home claiming they scared off a demon. But every now and then, they stumbled onto something real. stone circles locals still used, burned bundles of herbs in weird patterns, carved symbols older than Christianity, half a dozen peasants who really did not want to discuss their hobbies. The most famous of these secret groups were the Benandanti in northern Italy, people who literally said they left their bodies at night to fight witches and protect their crops. And the wild part? They believed it. The church interrogated them expecting demonic confessions, and instead got medieval Avengers roleplay. Then there were the forest magical healers, women and a few men, who used herbs, salves, moonlight rituals, and maybe some light chanting to treat illness. Herbalism wasn't illegal, unless you were good at it. Then suddenly it was devil magic. So yes, the whispers were true. Medieval Europe did have secret pagan cults hiding in the trees. Not evil. Not monstrous. Just very committed to not letting the church ruin their vibe. If you grew up imagining medieval monks as peaceful men quietly copying books and baking bread, I'm sorry to inform you that some of them were basically the CIA in robes. While villagers prayed, nobles schemed, and kings worried about their soup, the monasteries were conducting a very different kind of holy mission: information gathering. And yes, that's medieval for spying. The church, being the single largest institution in Europe, needed eyes everywhere. And who better than monks? They were literate, quiet, and already trained to observe human sin with the intensity of a judgmental cat. They travelled between monasteries, collected gossip disguised as confessions, and wrote everything down in neatly organised manuscripts. One could call them historians, but the more accurate term is intelligence analysts with better handwriting. The Dominicans were the worst offenders, or the best, depending on how much you enjoy organised paranoia. Their whole order was founded on rooting out heresy, which meant interviewing villagers, intercepting letters, and watching people a little too closely. If a medieval man sneezed near the wrong scripture, a Dominican friar magically appeared asking follow-up questions. Monastic travellers made excellent spies. They moved freely through kingdoms, carrying letters nobody dared inspect, because nobody wanted to go to hell for harassing a monk. Many kings secretly paid monks to report on court scandals, troop movements, and whether their nobles were planning a suspicious feast. It was the medieval version of a subscription service. Things became even more interesting with the rise of the Inquisition. Suddenly, the church had an entire institution dedicated to gathering incriminating information. Monks interviewed heretics, interrogated locals, and wrote down the juiciest rumours to send up the chain of command. Some reports were very serious: political uprisings, illegal pagan rites, hidden rebellions. Others read like medieval gossip magazines. Brother Gregory reports that the shoemaker's wife was seen at night carrying suspicious herbs. Possibly witch. Further surveillance needed. Not all monks were involved in spying, of course, but enough were that people began to notice. Villagers whispered that the monasteries knew everything, and they weren't wrong. A monk could walk into a town, buy bread, ask 3 polite questions, and suddenly know more about your marriage than your spouse did. So yes, the conspiracy was real. Behind the chanting and the candles, medieval monasteries ran a quiet, continent-wide network of information, secrets, and surveillance. And unlike most medieval institutions, it actually worked. It turns out the most dangerous weapon in the Middle Ages wasn't the sword, or the crossbow, or even poisoned stew. It was a monk with a very good memory. If you asked a medieval European what the Knights Templar were up to, they'd probably whisper something like, "Oh, you know, guarding treasure, hoarding secrets, worshipping mysterious heads, controlling kings, threatening the Pope, inventing banking, summoning demons, normal knight stuff." Medieval people loved a dramatic conspiracy, and the Templars were their favourite target. The best part? Some of it was actually true. The Templars began as a small group of knights sworn to protect pilgrims. Noble, holy, admirable. But then they experienced a terrible curse. They became successful. Within a century, they were so powerful that kings had to schedule their paranoia around them. The Templars owned castles, land, fleets of ships, and more money than half of Europe. They were essentially a medieval combination of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and that one cult your aunt keeps researching online. And with great power comes great suspicion. Rumours spread that the Templars guarded a massive treasure hoard. Unfortunately for Europe, this part is true. They were the first to create a Europe-wide banking system. Pilgrims deposited money in England and withdrew it in Jerusalem, which feels suspiciously modern for people who still feared mirrors. The Templars kept coded records, operated secure vaults, and moved money with the kind of efficiency that terrified kings and deeply annoyed tax collectors. Then there were the secret rituals. Templars met in private, conducted ceremonies at night, and swore oaths no outsider could witness. Naturally, this led Europe to assume they were worshipping a mysterious severed head named Baphomet, which is medieval for, we don't know what they're doing, so let's assume the worst. The truth? Their rituals were secret because they involved confessions, discipline, and organizational rules. Boring. But medieval minds could not accept boring. They needed drama. And drama they got. King Philip IV of France, perpetually broke and very talented at blaming other people, decided the Templars were heretics, which is medieval for, I want your stuff. He had them arrested, tortured, and forced into confessions so absurd they make modern conspiracy theories look shy. Except here's the twist. Philip wasn't entirely wrong. The Templars did hold a treasure, did run a secretive empire of money, and did keep knowledge hidden from the public. Not demonic knowledge, just banking procedures and military codes. But for medieval Europe, that was basically the same thing. So yes, the Templars were victims of lies, but also absolutely guilty of being too powerful for their own good. Their secrecy wasn't dark magic, it was good bookkeeping, which, in medieval Europe, was practically witchcraft anyway. When the Black Death rolled into Europe in 1347, people naturally began looking for answers. What caused it? How did it spread so fast? Why did it seem to prefer crowded cities and men who never washed their hands? Most villagers blamed demons, bad air, or their neighbour's weird-looking goat. But a particularly juicy conspiracy theory emerged. The church knew more about the plague than it publicly admitted. And disturbingly, this time, the conspiracy wasn't entirely wrong. The papacy and the higher clergy had access to medical reports, merchant letters, and incoming ship logs that ordinary people never saw. They knew when outbreaks were spreading through port cities. They knew when trade routes were collapsing. They knew that entire monasteries were dropping like flies. And while peasants were still out in the fields wondering why their neighbour suddenly exploded in boils, bishops were quietly packing their bags and temporarily relocating to countryside villas with much better airflow. To be fair, medieval clergy weren't doctors. Half of them thought illness came from corrupted humours, and the other half thought it came from God being mildly irritated. But they did have one undeniable advantage: information. And information in the Middle Ages moved slower than a peasant on a Monday morning. There are records of bishops closing city gates in advance of plague waves without explaining why. Monasteries locked themselves from the inside. Clergy warned each other in coded letters with phrases like, "The ship brings dark tidings," which is medieval for, "Do not go outside. Everything is on fire." Even more suspicious were the quarantine orders. Some were issued before the plague visibly reached the region, meaning someone, somewhere, knew something. Merchants noticed it too. Venetian traders wrote about strange warnings from church officials, telling them to avoid certain ports a week before the plague erupted there. That's not divine prophecy. That's insider trading with extra steps. Meanwhile, the official advice given to the public was less helpful. People were told to repent, pray harder, burn aromatic herbs, or avoid excessive joy. Yes, really, joy was considered a plague risk. Medieval Europe was truly committed to suffering. So did the church intentionally hide things? Probably not with malicious intent. But they absolutely prioritized themselves, and withheld timely warnings because they didn't want to cause panic, lose authority, or admit they had no idea how to stop it. In the end, the peasants weren't wrong. Someone did know more. they just weren't sharing. If you picture medieval monks as peaceful men humming hymns and tending herb gardens, it's time to gently set that image on fire. Because hidden among the holy texts and the chanting were certain specialists, discreet gentlemen, problem solvers, men who could recite the Psalms from memory and also eliminate a political rival without disturbing the choir practice. Yes, medieval Europe had cloistered assassins, and no, this is not the plot of a questionable Netflix show. It was real. These men weren't monks by spiritual calling, they were monks by convenience. Joining a monastery gave you shelter, food, legal protection, and the ability to travel between kingdoms without anyone asking why you had a suspiciously heavy bag. Monastic robes were basically the medieval version of an all-access VIP pass. And who hired these holy hitmen? Nobles, of course. The same people who were already trying to poison each other's soup. If a noble wanted something done quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability, he didn't send a knight. Knights were loud. Knights bragged. Knights tripped over their own armour. No, he sent brother someone who shouldn't be asked questions. These monks were often lay brothers, members of the monastery who performed manual labour and didn't spend their days copying manuscripts. They had strong arms, few witnesses, and an excellent excuse for travelling. I am collecting alms. Nothing suspicious there, except for the dagger tucked under the robe. The chronicles never say these men existed openly, but they leave clues, too many clues. A noble dies mysteriously. A political rival conveniently falls from a window. A stubborn landowner suddenly repents, donates everything to the church, and vanishes. Monks appear in letters complaining about brothers who fail to observe spiritual discipline, which is monastic code for someone keeps sneaking out at night and we don't know where he's going. There are even recorded cases of monks being caught with weapons, disguises, or heretical correspondence. None of them confessed, of course. Monks had excellent poker faces, and the added advantage of implying that any accusation was an attack on God himself, and kingdoms tolerated it. Why? Because monasteries solved problems. Efficiently, discreetly, with minimal clean-up required. So yes, medieval villagers whispered that some monks were more dangerous than their sermons suggested, and for once, the villagers were absolutely right. Behind the candles and the psalms, some monasteries housed men who could pray for your soul and send you to meet God personally. When people think of witch hunts, they imagine the 1500s and 1600s. Bonfires, pointy hats, angry men yelling about Satan hiding in their goat. But the truth is that secret witch hunts were happening long before they became fashionable. Medieval Europe didn't wait for the Renaissance to start panicking. They were already terrified, and already correct about some things. Before the official witch craze, villagers spoke in whispers about wise women gathering herbs at night. These were not broom-flying sorceresses. They were the local healers, midwives, and unofficial therapists. The people you visited when you couldn't afford a doctor, which was always because doctors in the Middle Ages mostly recommended bleeding you to death. These women knew plants, cures, poisons, childbirth, and how to make your husband's headache disappear, sometimes permanently. Their knowledge was extremely valuable, which immediately made the church suspicious in medieval Europe. Knowing things was practically a crime. So villagers created their own little conspiracy theory. These women were part of a secret network, sharing forbidden knowledge under the moonlight. Herbs were coded messages. Knotted cords were symbols of protection. Midnight gatherings were strategy meetings. And although it all sounds dramatic, it wasn't completely wrong. There were networks of healers who trained each other, passed down knowledge, and shared dangerous remedies quietly so the church wouldn't accuse them of witchcraft. But mistakes were made. Some women cured illnesses the church failed to cure. Some predicted storms better than priests. Some fixed marriages with love potions that definitely violated several commandments. Naturally, this meant they had to be in league with Satan. When livestock died, blame the healer. When crops failed, blame the healer. When your husband ran off to join the Crusades because you kept nagging him about taking out the chamber pot, surely the healer cast a spell. And yet, beneath the hysteria, the conspiracy theory held a sliver of truth. There really were secret gatherings of magical practitioners. Only their magic was just science, herbs, and experience. In a world run by superstition, competence looked supernatural. So medieval villagers began hunting witches long before the official manuals existed. They charged them in local courts, questioned them in barns, and occasionally tried to drown them in rivers. These early witch hunts were sloppy, chaotic, and extremely unprofessional, but tragically real. The irony: the only witches who actually existed were the ones trying to keep everyone alive, which, in the Middle Ages, was suspicious behaviour indeed. Medieval kings were dramatic. They loved grand gestures, heroic speeches, unnecessary wars, and occasionally faking their own deaths, or, at the very least, making everyone think they did. And the wild part? Medieval people suspected this. They whispered about it in taverns. They passed rumours down through generations, and in at least one deliciously messy case, their conspiracy theory wasn't entirely wrong. Enter Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, a man so eccentric, so intelligent, and so uncomfortably ahead of his time that Europe genuinely didn't know what to do with him. He spoke multiple languages, loved science, wrote poetry, and kept a personal zoo, which automatically made him suspicious in the eyes of medieval peasants, who believed any man who liked books was probably consorting with demons. Frederick II's death in 1250 was grand, public, and witnessed. The church breathed a sigh of relief. Europe buried him. Everyone moved on. Except they didn't. Because almost immediately, rumours spread that Frederick wasn't dead. He was merely hiding, resting, waiting, preparing to return and reclaim the empire like some medieval Batman, but with worse armour and better falconry hobbies. Entire cults sprang up around the idea. People claimed they saw him wandering forests in disguise. Merchants reported meeting a mysterious nobleman who paid in Frederick's old coinage. A fisherman insisted the emperor asked him for directions. Peasants swore a hooded figure attending mass in Sicily had Frederick's exact posture, which is a very specific thing to notice unless you're obsessed. You'd think this was typical medieval delusion, but then things got complicated. Into this chaos walked Richard of Eastwell, a man who claimed to be Richard III's secret son centuries later. Another suspiciously educated, suspiciously refined stranger who refused to explain his background. He spoke Latin. He knew royal etiquette. He had the bearing of someone who never carried his own laundry. Historians still argue about him. In both cases, something is undeniably off. Medieval rulers occasionally staged dramatic farewells, vanished for months, or switched identities for political safety. And since record-keeping was essentially Bob wrote it down before spilling wine on it, who could truly confirm anything? So yes, the conspiracy theory stood on shaky but tantalizing legs. Sometimes kings didn't die. They retired in secret, letting everyone else deal with the mess. And in a way, who could blame them? If you lived in a world of plagues, rebellions, crusades, and poisoned soup, you'd fake your death too. Few things terrified medieval Europeans more than water. Not demons, not plague, not taxes. Water. Because water was unpredictable. It could nourish your crops, drown your children, or give you dysentery before breakfast. So when people started dying mysteriously, villagers did what medieval villagers always did. Blamed the nearest well. The poisoned wells conspiracy spread like wildfire. If a family got sick, it was the well. If livestock died, the well. If the bread was burnt or your cousin tripped over a chicken, the well was clearly cursed. The Middle Ages had a very flexible relationship with cause and effect. But beneath the panic and shouting, there was a sinister truth. Sometimes wells really were poisoned. Not by witches, demons, or suspiciously shaped clouds, but by rival towns, invading armies, and the occasional extremely angry neighbour. During medieval sieges, poisoning wells was basically standard procedure. Armies would dump dead animals, toxic plants, or anything particularly disgusting into the enemy's water supply. Nothing says, please surrender, like finding a decomposing goat floating in your bucket. Siege manuals even recommended it. Imagine a military guide that calmly advises, Step 3, sabotage their plumbing. European villagers, however, didn't know about siege tactics. So when people started dying miles away from any battlefield, villagers invented their own explanations. Outsiders were the favourite suspects. A traveller passing through, poisoner, a merchant selling herbs, definitely a poisoner, someone who looked like they could read, don't even get started. One of the darkest examples occurred during the Black Death, when towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. It wasn't true, but the tragedy highlights how deeply the conspiracy had rooted itself in medieval minds. Water was dangerous, mysterious, and perfect for accusations. And yet, even in peaceful times, wells could become toxic. Rain washed waste into them. Dead rats fell in. Mouldy leaves fermented into a medieval smoothie of death. Most wells were essentially unfiltered holes in the ground, surrounded by people who bathed once per year and believed germs were part of astrology. So were wells poisoned? Technically, yes, but mostly by bacteria, something medieval people would have considered witchcraft anyway. The irony is painful. Medieval villagers terrified each other with stories of secret poisoners, while nature did most of the poisoning for free. But when the entire world feels unstable, you pick simple answers. And in the Middle Ages, the simplest answer to anything was, the well did it. Medieval Europe adored a good identity crisis. If someone wandered into town claiming to be a long-lost prince, people didn't question it. They immediately threw a feast, argued about lineage, and started sharpening pitchforks just in case. And this wasn't because medieval people were gullible. They were, but that's beside the point. It was because royal imposters actually happened frequently. In a world without photography, fingerprints, dental records, or even consistent spelling of names, identifying someone was basically a group guess. Does he look royal? Was the medieval version of a background check. And looking royal usually meant having all your teeth and not smelling like onions. Enter one of the strangest cases, Richard of Eastwell. According to local stories, he appeared in Kent in the 1400s, claiming, softly, politely, mysteriously, to be the secret son of Richard III. A bold claim, but then he demonstrated skills no ordinary peasant would have, reading Latin, writing beautifully, holding utensils properly, and not flinching when people mentioned taxes. Suspicious behaviour indeed. He never admitted it outright, but he hinted, heavily. And since medieval England adored drama, people believed him. Centuries later, historians still debate his origins because the details match just a little too well. Medieval record-keeping might as well have been done on napkins, so the possibility remains deliciously open. But Richard wasn't alone. Medieval Europe was crawling with resurrected royals. A popular example comes from Anastasia of Poland, who died young, supposedly, only for several women to later appear claiming to be her, complete with court knowledge and suspiciously familiar mannerisms. Entire regions went to war over whether someone was or was not a princess, because nothing says healthy governance, like a battlefield full of men yelling, "That's definitely her," while having no idea what she looked like. And then there were the cases where imposters weren't imposters at all. During crises, some rulers fled, hid, or attempted to escape assassination by disguising themselves. A king or prince in plain clothes wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a safety strategy, which meant that every mysterious stranger story had a thin layer of truth underneath. The real problem? Medieval politics loved a good plot twist. If a royal died under suspicious circumstances, which was always, people immediately assumed the body was fake, the death was staged, or the ruler was living incognito somewhere, probably regretting every choice that led to monarchy. So yes, royal imposters were a medieval conspiracy, and that conspiracy came true so often that, eventually, Europe stopped asking, "Is this possible?" and instead asked, "Okay, which cousin is pretending to be dead this time?" If you've ever wondered what the medieval equivalent of a restricted section looked like, Imagine a small, dusty room inside a monastery, locked with 3 bolts, guarded by a monk who looks like he hasn't slept since the Third Crusade. Inside, shelves of books the church didn't want anyone reading, and that villagers whispered about like they were cursed objects. And here's the twist. These forbidden book vaults actually existed. The church controlled most education in medieval Europe. If you wanted to read, write, or do anything more intellectually stimulating than counting sheep, you had to go through them. Naturally, this meant they also controlled what you weren't allowed to read. Anything that threatened their authority, contradicted scripture, or suggested that the earth did something scandalous like move was quietly removed from circulation. But they didn't burn everything. Burning is messy, smoky, and attracts peasants, who will definitely ask questions nobody wants to answer. Instead, they stored banned texts in special archives known as armaria, scriptoria vaults, or in some cases, literally just the locked room nobody enters except Brother Thomas, who looks guilty whenever he walks out. What was inside? A surprisingly eclectic mix. There were heretical gospels, declaring opinions that could land you in interrogation faster than you can say Inquisition. There were works of Arabic science that were clearly correct, but inconveniently ahead of Christian doctrine. There were medical treatises discussing anatomy in a way that made bishops faint. There were even ancient pagan manuscripts, which monks copied for research purposes, which is medieval for, I was curious and don't want to get in trouble. The best part is that church officials regularly argued about these vaults. Some believed the knowledge must be preserved for future generations. Others believed the knowledge must be locked away forever because it raised too many awkward questions. Questions like, if this pagan text correctly predicts an eclipse, what else is it right about? Silence. Awkward shuffling. A bishop coughing loudly to avoid further discussion. These vaults weren't mere rumour. They were policy. When inquisitors seized the libraries of accused heretics, they didn't destroy everything, they catalogued it, studied it, filed it away. Knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, was power. The conspiracy existed because people sensed exactly what was happening. Somewhere in those monasteries were books that could change minds, challenge authority, or reveal truths medieval Europe simply wasn't ready for. So were the villagers. Right? Absolutely. Behind the incense, behind the chanting, and behind the locked oak doors, the church kept a carefully curated treasure trove of knowledge. And like all treasure in the Middle Ages, the best way to protect it was to pretend it didn't exist. If there was one place in medieval Europe where conspiracy wasn't a theory, but a daily lifestyle choice, it was Italy. Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Siena, all beautiful places today, but in the Middle Ages they were basically high-budget gangster films with better architecture. These city-states spent centuries pretending to be peaceful trading hubs, while secretly waging a silent, non-stop war of espionage, bribery, and back-alley diplomacy. And for years, Italians whispered about a shadow conflict beneath the official alliances and treaties. A hidden war of spies, saboteurs, coded letters, and accidents that only seemed to happen to politically inconvenient people. The conspiracy sounded dramatic, even theatrical. Unfortunately, every part of it was true. You see, Italian city-states were extremely jealous. If Florence made money, Siena had a crisis. If Venice signed a trade deal, Genoa threw a tantrum. If Milan built a tower slightly taller than their neighbours, a feud erupted that lasted 3 generations. These places competed in everything: commerce, banking, architecture, fashion, assassinations. Yes, assassinations counted as cultural achievements. Out of this chaos emerged one of the most sophisticated espionage systems in medieval Europe. Venice especially was legendary. The Venetian government created an entire secret intelligence council, complete with coded messages, financial surveillance, diplomatic intercepts, and a network of spies sprinkled across Europe like paranoid confetti. Their enemies feared them. Their allies feared them. Even Venetians feared them. Venice also had the infamous Bosch di Leone, public drop boxes where citizens could anonymously report conspiracies, crimes, or that their neighbour was acting suspiciously Italian. These messages were reviewed by a secret council that decided what needed to be investigated, discouraged, or quietly eliminated. Italy didn't invent the deep state. It simply gave it better outfits. Meanwhile, Florence had its own spy network, staffed by the Medici family, who were so wealthy they probably could have bought the concept of honesty, and still said, maybe later. Florence specialised in bribery and banking manipulation. Milan specialised in intimidation. Genoa specialised in naval sabotage. Siena specialised in pretending it was minding its own business, while absolutely not minding its own business. The result was a constant, silent war. No armies marching, no banners waving, just merchants disappearing, letters rewritten, alliances snapped overnight, and treaties accidentally lost in fires. So yes, the conspiracy theorists were right. Italy wasn't just fighting wars, it was fighting all the wars, but quietly, politely, and always with impeccable style. Long before the Da Vinci Code convinced half the internet that Jesus had a secret family living comfortably in France, medieval Europe was already obsessed with holy bloodlines, hidden heirs, and scandalous genealogies. The conspiracy was simple. Noble families were secretly descended from sacred or royal ancestors, and they were hiding the proof. Villagers whispered it, nobles denied it, chroniclers recorded it with the energy of men who enjoyed gossip more than journalism. And the best part? Some of it was true. In medieval Europe, legitimacy was everything. You couldn't rule a village, let alone a kingdom, without waving around your family tree like a holy relic. But family trees in the Middle Ages were messy. Affairs happened. Wars happened. The occasional mysterious baby appeared during a pilgrimage. People pretended not to notice. It was all very polite and deeply suspicious. So nobles invented a solution: hide the embarrassing branches and exaggerate the impressive ones. Suddenly half the noble families in Europe claimed descent from Charlemagne, a man who, if these lineages were accurate, must have fathered approximately 4,000 children. Others claimed Trojan ancestors, Roman emperors, or King David. Medieval genealogists were not historians, they were creative writers with quills. But beneath the nonsense, real hidden bloodlines existed. Letters discovered centuries later revealed illegitimate royal children quietly placed in monasteries, foster homes, or distant countryside estates with the vague instruction, "Raise this boy and do not ask questions." Some resurfaced, some didn't. Some had descendants who discovered, 500 years later, that great-great-grandma wasn't a peasant after all. She was the secret daughter of a duke with poor self-control. One of the juiciest examples involves the Capetian dynasty of France, which secretly supported certain noble houses financially for generations. Houses suspiciously connected to lost royal infants. Meanwhile, English chroniclers recorded hidden heirs living under fake names during civil wars, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the throne, which usually meant never, absolutely never. And then there's the church. Monks occasionally wrote irritated notes like, "Another noble child has been entrusted to us, origin unclear," which is medieval code for somebody dropped off a baby again, and no one will tell us whose it is. So was there a conspiracy around holy bloodlines? Yes, but not because they were sacred. They were secret because they were scandalous affairs, hidden heirs, swapped identities, political insurance babies, all tucked away behind thick castle walls. Medieval Europe didn't need mythical descendants of Christ. It already had enough royal drama to last until the apocalypse. When medieval Christians whispered about secret Jewish and Muslim networks operating beneath the surface of Europe, they imagined something dramatic: shadowy conspirators, trading coded messages, plotting rebellions, and coordinating across kingdoms like a medieval Illuminati. Naturally, the church panicked, kings panicked, villagers panicked, and the goats panicked because goats always panic. But here's the twist. Almost no medieval person was prepared for. The networks actually existed, just not for the sinister reasons people imagined. They weren't planning world domination. They were planning survival. During the Middle Ages, Jewish and Muslim communities were frequently persecuted, overtaxed, expelled, or, on particularly stressful Tuesdays, accused of poisoning wells, summoning demons, or staring too suspiciously at bread. So, to avoid extinction, these communities created underground systems of communication and escape, quiet, subtle, and absolutely not meant to overthrow anything except their own misfortune. These networks included safe houses, coded routes, sympathetic merchants, and doctors who travelled in disguise. Entire families fled across borders using pre-arranged signals, a lamp in a window, a scratched doorway, or a phrase like, "Is the pomegranate harvest good this year?" which was medieval code for, "Hello, I am in danger and would like to leave immediately." Jewish communities maintained informal transit routes stretching from France to the Rhineland to Iberia, with each stop overseen by someone who had mastered the ancient art of pretending nothing suspicious was happening. Meanwhile, Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa maintained cross-Mediterranean escape paths, moving fugitives, scholars, and persecuted families with remarkable efficiency. Compared to most medieval institutions, which functioned like a donkey limping through molasses, these networks were shockingly competent. Of course, Christians interpreted this competence as proof of conspiracy. If a persecuted group managed to survive, that clearly meant they were plotting something. The logic was peak medieval. They escaped danger, suspicious, better increase the danger, and yet, behind the hysteria, these underground systems saved countless lives. They preserved knowledge, protected families, and kept cultural traditions alive during centuries of hostility. Some historians even argue they laid the early groundwork for later, more organized resistance movements during the Renaissance. Ironically, the only medieval conspiracy theorists who got this one right were the ones who intended harm. They sensed there was an invisible network, and there was. They simply misinterpreted its entire purpose. It wasn't a threat, it was a lifeline. So yes, the conspiracy was real. But instead of planning the downfall of Europe, these networks were doing something wildly uncharacteristic for the Middle Ages. They were helping people. Medieval Europe officially ran on feudalism. Kings, nobles, peasants, duties, tithes, and taxes that made absolutely no sense to anyone, including the people collecting them. This was the system everyone talked about, the system written in charters, the system priests preached about while ignoring their own financial habits. But beneath that wonderfully dysfunctional surface existed another system. A quiet, unofficial, unregulated maze of deals, favours, illegal markets, and under-the-table arrangements known today as the shadow economy in medieval terms. Just how things work, my son. And here's the fun part. Everyone pretended it didn't exist, while simultaneously participating in it daily. The conspiracy went like this. Groups of thieves, smugglers, moneylenders, and entrepreneurially flexible peasants operated outside the law, forming networks that stretched across towns and even kingdoms. Secret trade routes, black market goods, illegal borrowing, quiet bribes, all happening in every alley and tavern from London to Venice. Medieval people believed in this underground economy. They told stories about it. They warned their children about it. They drew very dramatic lines in the sand about how sinful it was. And they were absolutely right. Start with the thieves' guilds. Yes, they existed. No, they did not wear uniforms. But they organised territories, settled disputes, and punished independent thieves for violating professional courtesy. Medieval law enforcement was so useless that thieves created their own HR department. Then there were the unofficial moneylenders, often operating in back rooms of taverns, monasteries, or that one house on the corner everyone avoided, because charging interest was technically a sin, unless you did it quietly, in which case it was mutual aid. Smuggling was everywhere. Salt, wine, grain, wool, ink, iron. If it could be taxed, someone was smuggling it. The king's tariff was less a law and more a polite suggestion no one took seriously. Entire villages would mysteriously lose shipments right before tax collectors arrived, only for those same goods to reappear moments later in the barn of someone named Pietro who found them on the road. Markets had their own conspiracies. Sellers fixed prices. Bakers hid cheap flour in bread. Butchers adjusted weights. Fishmongers claimed their fish was fresh when it clearly died during the First Crusade. Everyone lied a little, stole a little, and nodded politely at Sunday Mass as if God hadn't watched them cheat 3 customers that morning. So, yes, the medieval shadow economy was real. It was thriving, and it was the only part of the economy that actually worked consistently. The biggest conspiracy wasn't that it existed, it was that everyone pretended they weren't involved. Night in Kaifeng arrived softly, like silk falling over the city, but the pleasure quarters never truly slept. As the sun slipped behind the palace roofs and merchants closed their shutters, another world awakened. One built not on laws or duty, but on sensation, artistry, and the delicate promise of escape. Lanterns lit first, trembling gently as servants carried them out in long chains, each flame protected behind lacquered shades of red, gold, and soft jade. Soon the entire district glowed like a small constellation brought down to earth, shimmering above the cobblestones that had been worn smooth by generations of wandering feet. Walking through the first archway, a visitor heard the world change. The clatter of daytime markets faded behind them, replaced by the soft stroke of zithers, the rhythmic tapping of wooden blocks, and laughter drifting through silk curtains. Tea houses opened their doors with quiet pride, each one promising a slightly different atmosphere. Some peaceful and scholarly, others lively and filled with actors rehearsing lines before their evening performances. The air smelled of roasted barley tea, honeyed pastries, sandalwood incense, and occasionally a faint touch of plum wine. What made Kaifeng's floating world unique was not only its beauty, but its illusion. The sense that once inside, time loosened its grip. Scholars who had spent their days buried in scrolls arrived to recite fresh poetry. Government clerks, exhausted from bureaucracy, came seeking a few hours of elegance. Even wandering monks were known to stop at the district's entrance and watch quietly, as if observing another realm entirely. The streets twisted like painted ribbons, each turn leading to a new spectacle, a puppeteer surrounded by children, a masked performer practicing acrobatic leaps, courtesans behind gauzy screens preparing their hairpins, calligraphy sets and embroidered robes. Everything was movement, music, and anticipation, yet contained within a serene, dreamlike order. Visitors often remarked that entering Kaifeng's pleasure quarters felt like stepping into a painting where nothing harsh or hurried could touch them. The laughter was gentle, the music rounded and soft, the lantern light warm enough to make even passing faces appear poetic. It was a world both real and unreal, crafted deliberately to soothe the mind, stir curiosity, and make every guest feel, if only for an evening, weightless. Here, pleasure was not loud or crude. It was refined, carefully arranged, and wrapped in artistry. And this was only the beginning. If the entrance to Kaifeng's floating world was a soft breath, then its tea houses were the heartbeat, steady, warm, and endlessly inviting. They lined the district like polished jewels, each with its own character, yet all sharing the same devotion to refinement. Some were modest, with bamboo blinds and simple clay pots. Others glowed with lacquered pillars, jade-green tiles, and carved screens depicting cranes, plum blossoms, or scenes from beloved operas. Together, they formed a delicate corridor of light and aroma that enticed newcomers deeper into the quarter. Stepping inside a tea house meant stepping into an atmosphere carefully woven from ritual and intimacy. The first sensation was always the scent. Toasted barley, chrysanthemum petals, osmanthus blossoms, or the deeper, earthier warmth of pu'er bricks softened by age. Servers moved with practiced grace, gliding between silk cushions and low wooden tables with trays of steaming cups arranged like miniature constellations. Conversations remained hushed, as though even laughter respected the delicate balance of flavours and sounds. These tea houses were more than places to drink. They were listening rooms, social theatres, and sanctuaries for wandering thoughts. Scholars gathered here to debate poetry and philosophy, challenging one another with new verses scribbled hastily on fresh scrolls. Aspiring officials discussed their exam prospects, pretending calm while hiding their anxiety. Merchants negotiated deals beneath layers of polite formality, and soldiers passing through the capital sat quietly, savouring a few hours of peace before returning to harsher duties. Yet the true charm of these spaces came from the courtesans who performed within them. Unlike the women of the brothels, these artists were prized for their mastery of subtlety. They recited poems with gentle clarity, played zithers whose strings shimmered under lamplight, and painted calligraphy so fluid it seemed to breathe. Their presence did not overwhelm the room. Instead, they shaped it, each movement balanced and deliberate. Visitors often felt as though the tea houses held a secret rhythm. Voices flowed like soft rivers, music rose in delicate waves, and the clinking of porcelain cups punctuated each moment like a quiet heartbeat. Some guests came seeking conversation, others came seeking silence, but all left with the same lingering impression. Here, time slowed down and became gentle, as if it too wished to sit and savour one more cup. In the floating world of Kaifeng, pleasure began not with desire, but with calm, and the tea houses were its purest expression. As night deepened in Kaifeng's floating world, the tea houses exhaled their last trails of steam, and another sound began to rise. The distant thrum of drums, the flutter of silk sleeves, and the warm chorus of voices filtering from the district's many theatres. These were the soul of the pleasure quarters, places where imagination was not merely entertained but completely unbound. To enter a Kaifeng theatre was to surrender oneself to dreams painted in movement, colour and song. The buildings themselves were wonders of careful craftsmanship. Some were simple wooden halls with open stages and benches worn smooth by years of use. Others rivaled temple architecture with carved rafters, dragon-headed beams, and facades decorated with scenes from ancient myths. Lanterns hung overhead in tiered arrangements, casting a golden glow that softened every contour and turned the audience's faces into floating shapes of anticipation. Inside, actors prepared behind screens painted with plum blossoms and running horses. Their makeup was not merely decoration, but transformation. White powder to smooth the face into an otherworldly mask, bold crimson accents to define emotion, and ink-black lines that could shift an expression with the slightest movement of the eyes. Costumes shimmered in the lamplight. Embroidered robes of turquoise, mustard yellow, snow lotus white, and imperial red, each carrying symbols of the roles they were meant to embody. The performances themselves were a harmony of disciplines, blending poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. A single gesture of a silk sleeve could suggest heartbreak. The twirl of a sword could spark tension like a sudden gust of wind. Musicians sat at one side of the stage, plucking zithers, striking wooden clappers, or coaxing long, trembling notes from bamboo flutes. Stories from the past came alive. Generals torn between duty and love, spirits haunting the mortal world, lovers separated by family honour, immortals descending from clouds painted on backdrop screens. For the audience, the theatre offered escape of the purest kind. Merchants forgot their ledgers. Scholars forgot their exams. Wandering travellers forgot their fatigue. In the pleasure quarters, a well-told story could lift a person out of the weight of their everyday life and place them gently into another realm entirely. When the final note faded and lanterns dimmed, guests emerged slowly, as if waking from a shared dream. And as they stepped back into the glowing streets, Kaifeng's floating world seemed even more magical, as though the performances had seeped into the night itself. In the heart of Kaifeng's floating world, beyond the tea houses and theatres, lived the figures who embodied the district's deepest allure, the courtesans. These were not merely entertainers, nor simply companions. They were artists in the fullest sense, trained from childhood in poetry, music, painting, etiquette, and the delicate unspoken art of emotional presence. To meet a renowned courtesan was to encounter refinement shaped into human form. Their residences, known as Hua Yuan, flower pavilions, stood quietly behind carved wooden gates. Some were small and intimate, filled with soft cushions, shelves of inkstones, and vases of seasonal blossoms changed daily by servants. Others were grand, with inner courtyards, koi ponds, and moon gates through which lantern light drifted like floating petals. Regardless of size, each pavilion carried the gentle fragrance of incense, cosmetics, and newly brushed silk, creating an atmosphere of tranquil anticipation. A courtesan's charm began long before she spoke. Her appearance was a composition in itself, hair styled into elegant loops and combed smooth with perfumed oils. Silk robes dyed in hues that flattered her complexion, pale lilac, lake blue, lotus white, embroidered with subtle threads of silver or gold. When she moved, the fabrics whispered, soft as breath. When she sat, her posture carried the serenity of someone who understood the power of stillness, but their true art was expression. A courtesan could recite a Tang poem with such clarity that each syllable felt like falling dew. She could paint calligraphy characters so fluid that the strokes seemed to ripple like water. She could play the pipa with fingers so deft that listeners swore they heard not wood and strings, but wind moving through bamboo. Even her conversation carried a gentle rhythm, attentive, thoughtful, never hurried. Visitors sought them not for crude pleasure, but for respite from the world. Scholars discussed verses with them and left inspired officials, worn thin by politics, found comfort in their patience and wit. Young nobles, restless and uncertain, felt steadied by their quiet confidence. A single evening with a talented courtesan could feel like stepping into a sanctuary where one's burdens melted, replaced by calm. Yet beneath their elegance lay an unspoken truth. The life of a courtesan required discipline, artistry, and resilience. Their refinement was not effortless. It was crafted with devotion. And for those who entered their pavilions, the experience remained unforgettable. A moment suspended between reality and beauty, held gently in graceful hands, beyond the flower pavilions, deeper into the dimmer alleys of Kaifeng's floating world, stood the establishments that blended art with intimacy, the refined brothels, known for their elegance rather than excess. These were not places of hurried indulgence, but carefully curated sanctuaries where desire was softened by ritual, conversation, and cultivated charm. Even their entrances spoke of restraint. Carved wooden doors, silk banners that shifted with the breeze, and lanterns whose warm glow promised companionship, wrapped in grace. Inside, the air carried a subtle mixture of incense, powdered sandalwood, and the faint sweetness of plum blossoms arranged in porcelain vases. Rooms were decorated with folding screens painted with cranes or mountain scenes, their colours muted under candlelight. Low tables held calligraphy brushes, wine cups, and instruments waiting for performances. Everything was arranged to slow the visitor's breath, to quiet restless thoughts, and to prepare them for a different rhythm of the night. Unlike the courtesans of the flower pavilions, celebrated for artistry above all, the women of these houses specialized in weaving emotion and comfort. They welcomed guests with soft voices and practiced gentleness, guiding conversations with an intuitive understanding of mood. A guest's troubles were never dismissed. Rather, they were absorbed into the warm atmosphere, becoming part of the evening's quiet unfolding. Wine was served sparingly, never to dull the senses, but to loosen stiffness and open space for genuine presence. Honeyed plum wine, chrysanthemum-infused rice wine, or delicate pear liquor were poured into small, translucent cups. Servers moved silently, refilling only when a guest's cup reached its final sip, as if reading minds rather than watching for gestures. What surprised many newcomers was the emphasis on connection rather than physicality. A night here might involve reciting poems, listening to gentle songs played on the pipa, or sharing stories beneath lantern light that flickered softly across walls. Intimacy, when it happened, unfolded gradually, more like calligraphy than passion, each stroke deliberate, balanced and mindful. For weary officials, lonely scholars, and travellers far from home, these refined brothels offered something essential, a place where one felt seen, not as a title, a rank, or a burdened mind, but as a person. The women, skilled in both empathy and subtlety, created an atmosphere where vulnerability was met with grace. By the time a guest stepped back into the glowing streets, the world felt lighter. Desire had not consumed them. It had soothed them, shaped into gentle companionship by the floating world's quietest artists. Behind the laughter, music, and gentle bustle of Kaifeng's floating world lay spaces very few visitors ever saw, the hidden gardens and moonlit retreats reserved for the truly trusted, the discreet, or the exceptionally fortunate. These secluded courtyards were woven into the pleasure quarters like secret threads, quiet sanctuaries where the night deepened and the world softened into something intimate and dreamlike. Reaching one often required passing through a narrow passageway, its walls lined with bamboo that whispered in the faintest breeze. A carved gate, simple, elegant, and always half-shadowed, opened into a courtyard bathed in pale moonlight. Here, the noise of the city disappeared as if caught by unseen hands. The air cooled. The scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp stone replaced incense and wine. These gardens were designed with purpose, not to impress through grandeur, but to soothe through harmony. Small koi ponds reflected the moon, their surfaces occasionally broken by a ripple as fish glided beneath lotus leaves. Rock formations were arranged with the same precision found in classical painting, each stone chosen not for size, but for its ability to balance the space. Pebbled paths curved gently, avoiding straight lines, as if to encourage wandering rather than arriving. Pavilions stood at the edges, their lattice windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, low couches were set with embroidered cushions, scrolls lay open on lacquered tables, and teapots released steady curls of steam. These retreats were not built for revelry. They were built for quiet conversation, unhurried reflection, and the kind of companionship that needed no performance. Courtesans often brought their closest patrons here, not for intimacy in the traditional sense, but for something far rarer, sincerity. Away from the eyes and expectations of the district, masks often fell away. Officials spoke of their doubts, scholars confessed fears the exams never allowed them to express, and wanderers told stories the roads had forced them to keep to themselves. The women, skilled in reading the undercurrents of emotion, listened with patient awareness. Sometimes a peeper was played so softly that the notes seemed to float rather than echo. Sometimes only silence filled the space, shared comfortably between two people watching the lantern light tremble on the pond's surface. And sometimes, when the moon was high and the jasmine scent strongest, guests felt as though they had stepped entirely outside the world. These hidden gardens were the floating world's quiet heart, places where pleasure transformed into peace, and where the night itself seemed to pause to listen. In Kaifeng's floating world, music and calligraphy were not simply pastimes. They were languages, refined expressions that revealed the inner rhythm of the night. While visitors often arrived seeking conversation, comfort, or performance, many found themselves unexpectedly captivated by these quieter arts. They formed the backbone of the district's emotional landscape, turning fleeting evenings into memories that lingered like ink on silk. Music came first, drifting through the pleasure quarters like a soft breeze. The pipa, with its pear-shaped body and bright, fluid notes, was the most familiar voice of the night. Courtesans plucked its strings with fingertips, hardened by practice, yet softened by grace, producing melodies that could shift from playful to melancholic with a single change of tempo. Alongside it, the guqin offered deeper, more meditative tones, slow, trembling vibrations that seemed to resonate directly in the chest. Guests who closed their eyes often swore they could hear mountains, rivers, and vast open skies within its unhurried rhythms. Bamboo flutes added another layer, carrying warm, breathy notes that floated above the district like birds crossing a dusk sky. Small ensembles sometimes gathered spontaneously in tea houses or pavilions, blending instruments the way calligraphers blend ink. The result was not a performance meant to dazzle, but an atmosphere meant to envelop, each note placed with care, each silence allowed to breathe. Calligraphy offered a different kind of quiet magic. Courtesans kept inkstones ready at all times, along with brushes of wolf, rabbit, or goat hair selected for specific strokes. When a guest expressed interest, a woman might kneel beside a low table and grind ink slowly, allowing its fragrance to rise before guiding the brush across fresh paper. The act was meditative, its beauty lying not only in the finished characters, but in the fluid motion of wrist and arm. Some wrote classical verses. Others painted free-flowing characters meant to match the mood of the evening. Guests often found themselves mesmerized, not by the meaning of the words, but by the serenity of the process, the way each stroke seemed to gather emotion and release it with controlled precision. To witness music and calligraphy in Kai Feng's floating world was to understand that artistry here was not ornamental, but essential. It created moments that required nothing but presence. And in a world where so much of life rushed forward relentlessly, these arts invited guests to pause, to breathe, to listen, to watch ink bloom on paper and realize that beauty could be both delicate and enduring. The pleasure quarters of Kai Feng were shaped as much by those who visited them as by those who performed within them. Each night drew in a mosaic of personalities: scholars, merchants, government officials, travelers and dreamers, all seeking something different, yet all softened by the district's gentle spell. Here, status blurred, titles lost their stiffness, and people met one another not through rank, but through mood, curiosity, and shared appreciation for subtle beauty. Scholars were among the most common visitors. Many had spent the day buried in the rigours of preparing for the imperial examinations, a system that demanded perfect memory, flawless reasoning, and endless discipline. By the time evening arrived, their minds ached with Confucian classics and bureaucratic anxieties. In the floating world, they found release tea-houses became their temporary academies, where debates flowed more freely, and courtesans, skilled in literature, offered insights that surprised even the most confident young intellectuals. Some scholars left with new verses to ponder, others left with hearts gently stirred by a courtesan's calm smile. Merchants, weary from negotiation and travel, came seeking something different. Companionship that didn't hinge on profit. They enjoyed the warmth of a shared drink, stories exchanged beside lantern light, and the comfort of being treated not as negotiators, but as humans. Many brought exotic goods from distant provinces, spices, fabrics, carved trinkets, and gifted them to their favourite courtesans, hoping not to buy affection, but to honour artistry. Officials arrived cautiously, wrapped in layers of duty and secrecy. Yet within the pleasure quarters, even strict-faced bureaucrats softened. Some sought intellectual sparring partners, others sought silence. A few came simply to observe, finding comfort in watching life unfold without needing to control it. The courtesans understood how to navigate these men, listening without judgment, offering empathy without obligation. Then there were the wanderers, individuals with stories the road had shaped, soldiers between assignments, monks passing through the capital, entertainers from other cities, and young dreamers unsure of their place in the world. They came without expectations, content simply to sit beneath lanterns, sip warm tea, and feel part of a wider, gentler human tapestry. What bound all these groups together was a shared desire for refuge. The pleasure quarters were not an escape from responsibility, but a pause from its weight, a place where emotion, beauty, and conversation flowed freely. Here, every visitor, no matter their origin, found a small corner of belonging in Kai Feng's luminous night. As night in Kai Feng slowly thinned into the pale edges of dawn, the pleasure quarters began their quiet transformation. Lanterns, once glowing like warm constellations, flickered as their oil ran low. The music softened, conversations tapered off, and the floating world, so alive only hours before, began to fold itself gently away, like silk robes being carefully stored after an evening of elegance. The streets at this hour carried a rare stillness. The laughter and footsteps that had echoed beneath the eaves were now muted, replaced by the soft sweep of brooms and the rustle of early morning vendors preparing their stalls. The scent of jasmine and heated wine faded, replaced by the cooler fragrance of dew on stone, and the faint sweetness of steamed buns rising in nearby kitchens. Tea houses closed their carved doors one by one, curtains falling like tired eyelids after a long night of stories, debates, and hushed secrets. Within the flower pavilions, courtesans extinguished their candles and loosened their elaborate hairstyles, letting the long weight of their day slip free. Their instruments rested on low tables, strings cooling in the morning air. The women moved with a gentler, more private grace now, not the polished performance of the night, but the quiet routine of those who lived between two worlds. Some sat by their windows, watching the sky brighten. Others wrote a final line of calligraphy to settle their minds before sleep. For them, dawn marked not the beginning, but the end. Hidden gardens fell completely silent. Moonlit ponds that had reflected whispered confessions now mirrored the earliest hints of sunlight. The koi moved lazily, undisturbed by the absence of voices. The pavilions stood empty, their paper windows glowing softly, as if holding the last traces of the night's memories. Even here, the atmosphere shifted, from enchantment to rest, from intimacy to stillness, too. Patrons departed slowly, stepping out with the lingering softness that the district so carefully cultivated. Scholars held their robes a little tighter, thinking over poems recited hours earlier. Officials walked with lighter expressions, their burdens temporarily eased. Merchants breathed in the cool morning air, savouring the rare feeling of a night spent not in negotiation, but in gentle company. By the time the sun rose fully, the floating world had nearly vanished. The pleasure quarters appeared ordinary again, just another part of the city. Yet those who had walked its lantern-lit paths carried something with them, the sensation of having lived, even briefly, in a realm shaped by art, beauty, and human connection. And they knew that when night returned, Kaifeng's hidden world would awaken once more, ready to offer another evening of soft light, refined companionship, and dreams painted in music and silk. When people imagine Alexander the Great, they picture the battles, the dust of Issus, the river charge at the Hydaspes, the phalanx locked in gleaming formation. But none of those victories would have existed without something quieter, far less glamorous, yet infinitely more impressive: the logistical machine behind him. His army did not simply march across continents because they were brave. They marched because every step was calculated, because the supplies flowed, because the system worked. From the moment Alexander left Macedon in 334 BCE, he wasn't just leading an army, he was commanding a moving city of nearly 40,000 men. This city stretched for kilometers, when on the move, with soldiers, cavalry, engineers, siege specialists, medics, blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, and interpreters. Behind them came thousands of animals: mules, camels, pack horses, each loaded with tools, food, spare weapons, and medical supplies. The army had no trucks, no engines, no radios, yet it coordinated movement across some of the harshest terrain on Earth with a precision modern militaries still study. Alexander inherited a brilliant system from his father, King Philip II, but he refined it ruthlessly. The army travelled light, extraordinarily light for its size. Soldiers carried only essential gear: weapons, armour, a cloak, a few days' worth of grain, and often a simple cooking pot. Tents were mostly reserved for officers. Ordinary soldiers slept under the open sky, reducing baggage weight and increasing speed. The less they carried, the faster they moved. And speed, for Alexander, was as deadly as a spear. But movement was only half the story. The real miracle lay in supplying the army. Alexander understood that fuel, food, water, fodder, was as important as bronze and iron. His scouts rode days ahead, mapping wells, rivers, and villages. Local cooperation was negotiated before the army ever arrived. If an area couldn't support the troops, routes were changed. If grain was needed, caravans were organised. If the land was barren, rations were adjusted and marches were shortened to avoid exhaustion. This careful choreography made Alexander's army something almost unnatural for its time, a force that could move swiftly, strike suddenly, and survive in environments where other armies would starve. The logistics were invisible to most, but they were the heartbeat, the silent engine, the reason a young king could take one army across deserts, mountains, and empires, and never let it collapse under its own weight. Feeding 40,000 men was not a challenge. It was a crisis waiting to happen every single day. Alexander's commanders understood this better than anyone. A soldier could fight without sleep. He could march with bleeding feet. But without food and water, the army collapsed, discipline vanished, and the momentum of the campaign died. So, before any battle, any victory, any moment of glory, there was grain. Tons of it, hauled, bought, taxed, or foraged to keep the machine alive. The backbone of the army's diet was barley and wheat. Each soldier consumed roughly a kilogram a day. Multiply that by tens of thousands, add cavalry horses, pack animals, and the herds that followed the army, and the numbers spiraled quickly into something staggering. Alexander solved this not with stockpiles, which slowed movement, but with constant acquisition. His scouts and quartermasters rode ahead, securing agreements with towns and villages before the army arrived. They negotiated grain, fodder, salt, dried meat, and sometimes livestock, all delivered directly to the army's route. When cooperation failed, the Macedonians foraged aggressively. This wasn't random plundering, it was an organized sweep. Units spread out across a radius around the marching column, gathering grain, cutting fodder, and seizing supplies. But Alexander preferred diplomacy over destruction. Burn a village today, and there's no food tomorrow. Secure its loyalty and the supply line strengthens. The cavalry required even more attention. A war horse ate as much as 10 men, and Alexander had thousands. Grasslands determined routes as much as strategy. In barren regions, herds of sheep and cattle marched with the army, creating a living supply line. Fresh meat, milk, hides, all moved on 4 legs, eating the land under them and feeding the army as needed. Water was the ultimate dictator of movement. On the march, the army often left at dawn, stopping at rivers or wells by noon before heat became lethal. Scouts identified water sources days ahead, marking safe routes across regions where a single mistake could mean dehydration and death. Alexander treated supply not as an afterthought, but as an invisible battlefield. Winning this battle meant his men stayed strong. Losing it meant collapse. Every day the army marched, the supply officers fought their own war. One measured not in casualties, but in grain sacks, hoofprints, and the precious sound of water flowing where it was needed. Most Alexander's victories are often remembered for their heroic clashes, phalanx versus empire, cavalry versus chaos. But the real battleground lay beneath the soldiers' feet. Terrain was both enemy and ally. Roads, mountains, rivers, deserts, and passes shaped the pace, direction, and survival of the campaign. Far more than any general's intentions, Alexander understood this instinctively. He treated land the way a master sailor treats wind, something to respect, exploit, and never underestimate. The Macedonian army moved along routes chosen with obsessive precision. Scouts and engineers rode ahead, studying the ground, measuring distances, locating water, and evaluating whether a column miles long could pass. A road too narrow or muddy could snarl the entire army and expose it to ambush. A river too swift could drown hundreds of men and animals. Time and again, Alexander avoided disaster simply by altering a route by a few miles. A small adjustment with massive consequences. Crossing mountains was among the hardest tasks. The Balkan ranges, the Taurus mountains, and especially the Hindu Kush tested the army beyond endurance. Narrow passes forced men to march single file. Cold turned weapons brittle. Snow blinded horses. Avalanches and rockfalls threatened entire units. Yet Alexander planned each ascent with mathematical calm. Breaks at sheltered ledges. Fires prepared in advance. Pack animals redistributed to prevent accidents. and reserves of grain saved specifically for these deadly climbs. The deserts were even worse. The Syrian steppe, the fringes of Mesopotamia, and later the Gedrosian desert presented a kind of warfare without an enemy. Heat, thirst, disorientation. Alexander's movement through these regions depended entirely on prior information. Local guides, captured scouts, traders and nomads were interrogated or bribed for knowledge of wells, hidden springs and shaded wadis. A single incorrect direction could doom thousands. Alexander's genius was not just following advice, but choosing the right advisors. Even open plains required skill. The army marched in flexible blocks, keeping cavalry close to protect supply trains. Engineers improved roads on the spot, levelling earth, laying planks over marshy ground, and reinforcing banked river edges. Where bridges didn't exist, they built them. Where rivers were too wide, Alexander used ferries, rafts, or captured ships. Every crossing was a construction project executed at military speed. Movement wasn't just transportation, it was strategy. By mastering the land, Alexander mastered time. He arrived when enemies thought him weeks away. He struck before they believed movement was possible. Terrain didn't slow him, it amplified him. And that, more than any sword, made his campaign unstoppable. No ancient campaign survived on strength alone. Armies without information walked blind into deserts, ambushes, empty storehouses, and poisoned wells. Alexander understood this better than any commander of his age. His empire was built not just by phalanxes, but by eyes and ears, scouts, informants, interpreters, diplomats, and local guides who formed the nervous system of his logistical machine. Every march began with reconnaissance. Days before the main column moved, Alexander's prodromoi, light cavalry scouts, rode out in wide arcs ahead, sometimes covering 50 kilometers a day. They mapped terrain, checked water sources, counted livestock in villages, and watched for hostile forces. Their reports determined everything: the route, the pace, the timing, the need for supplies. A wrong report could kill thousands. A good one saved them, but scouts alone weren't enough. Alexander relied heavily on local cooperation. In Asia Minor, he negotiated with Greek cities who gladly opened their gates. In Syria and Mesopotamia, he made deals with caravan traders who knew every well and oasis. In Bactria and Sogdia, he turned captured tribal leaders into guides rather than enemies, offering them positions, wealth, or amnesty. Alexander understood something simple but rare for his time. A coerced guide tells you where you want to go. A willing guide tells you where you need to go. Linguistic intelligence was crucial. The army employed interpreters skilled in Persian, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of regional dialects. They questioned villagers about food stores, asked shepherds about mountain passes, and listened to merchants' rumours about enemy movements. Sometimes Alexander himself conducted interrogations. His curiosity was legendary. A single shepherd, a caravan driver, even a child who knew where a hidden spring lay, could determine whether the next day's march ended in success or disaster. Diplomacy served logistics as much as strategy. Alexander frequently sent envoys ahead of the army to negotiate supplies, request safe passage, or intimidate local rulers into cooperation. Cooperation meant food and water. Resistance meant scorched earth and starvation. So Alexander made cooperation profitable: protection for loyalty, autonomy for obedience, and honor for assistance. Local elites often preferred partnership to destruction. Information allowed the army to move like a precision weapon. Without intelligence, the phalanx might still fight bravely, but bravery doesn't locate rivers, refill grain storerooms, or reveal hidden roads. Alexander's scouts and informants didn't just support the campaign, they enabled it. They turned the unknown into the predictable, and the predictable into victory. Battles may have defined Alexander's legend, but sieges defined his endurance. Taking a walled city was not a matter of courage. It was a matter of logistics, engineering supplies, manpower, timber, tools, food reserves, and above all, time. Every siege drained resources at a terrifying pace. And yet Alexander never hesitated to assault a fortified city because he had mastered the unmistakable rhythm of siege warfare: build, supply, pressure, and outlast. When the army laid siege to a city, the first order was not to attack. It was to build. Engineers and carpenters stepped forward with tools, axes, and ropes. They required huge quantities of timber for ladders, battering rams, catapults, torsion engines, siege towers, and protective screens. This timber came from forests miles away, cut by labour detachments who marched with axes rather than spears. The trees were felled, shaped, loaded onto carts or pack animals, and hauled to the siege lines. The army became a construction workforce overnight. Alexander's engineers were among the finest in the ancient world. They analysed walls, identified weak points, calculated angles for artillery, and directed the placement of siege towers. Carpenters built platforms and walkways. Miners dug tunnels beneath walls, propping them with timber that could later be burned to collapse entire sections. Every structure required a steady flow of nails, ropes, pulleys, hides, shields, and spare wood. Siege logistics resembled running a massive workshop under hostile fire. Food became a bigger challenge during sieges because the army stopped moving. When stationary, consumption rose while foraging decreased. To compensate, Alexander pre-planned supply lines. Before beginning a siege, grain was stored in temporary depots behind the army. Convoys of pack animals rotated between depots and the front lines. When possible, he secured cooperation from nearby villages to keep food flowing. A siege could last days or months. Without prearranged supply, even the strongest army starved. Time was the most precious resource of all. A prolonged siege risked disease, desertion, supply shortages, and reinforcements arriving for the enemy. Alexander therefore used constant pressure artillery, bombarded walls day and night. Sappers dug relentlessly. Marines conducted amphibious assaults when cities stood by water. The goal was not merely to break walls, but to break morale, to ensure the city surrendered before the logistical clock ran out. Every stone hurled from a catapult, every tower rolled forward, every underground tunnel supported by timber reflected the same truth. Alexander didn't win sieges through brute force. He won them through logistics, a blend of engineering, calculation, and relentless preparation that wore down enemy cities long before the final breach. Water, though essential for survival, was also one of the most dangerous obstacles Alexander's army faced. Rivers were unpredictable. Floods could wipe out camps. Currents could sweep away cavalry. Wide crossings could split the army, leaving half exposed to ambush. Yet Alexander crossed more major rivers than any commander of his age: the Granicus, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, and countless smaller streams. Each crossing was less a simple march and more a logistical miracle of coordination, engineering, and timing. The first step was reconnaissance. Scouts measured depth, speed, bank stability, and possible fording points. Engineers then determined the safest method. In shallow rivers, soldiers crossed in tight formations, shields linked to break the current. Horses swam beside them, guided by reins held high. But deeper rivers demanded ingenuity. Alexander used ferry boats and makeshift rafts whenever possible. Local vessels were seized or hired. Horses were ferried across on barges or made to swim, guided by handlers paddling alongside. The army lashed reeds, logs, and inflated animal skins together to create buoyant platforms capable of carrying siege equipment, carts, and grain. Artillery was dismantled into pieces, ferried across, and reassembled on the other bank. Alexander's favourite trick was psychological, crossing at night or upstream, forcing enemies to guess the point of crossing. At the Tigris, the army crossed under cover of darkness, shields strapped to their backs as flotation devices. At the Hydaspes, he repeatedly marched his troops up and down the riverbank to confuse King Porus, then used a hidden island upstream to launch a surprise crossing in heavy rain. Maritime logistics expanded dramatically once Alexander controlled the Phoenician ports. Sidonian and Tyrian shipwrights built and repaired vessels for him. Fleets carried grain, siege equipment and reinforcements along the Mediterranean coast, making coastal marches far safer. Later, in Mesopotamia and India, river fleets became floating supply depots. Boats escorted the army, carrying tons of grain, medical supplies, extra weapons, and even replacement horses. These fleets turned rivers from obstacles into highways. Storms, however, were relentless enemies. On some occasions, Alexander halted movement for days, waiting for currents to calm or for engineers to build stronger rafts. He understood that rushing a river crossing could destroy an army faster than any enemy general. Every successful crossing strengthened his legend. But the real triumph lay in logistics. Alexander conquered rivers not by bravery, but by preparation, engineering skill, and a disciplined choreography that turned dangerous waters into stepping stones across an entire continent. Alexander's army marched on more than grain and discipline. It marched on bodies. The human engine powering his conquests was constantly under threat from exhaustion, wounds, disease, and fear. Keeping tens of thousands of men healthy, motivated, and mentally stable across years of non-stop campaigning required a logistical strategy as sophisticated as feeding them. Alexander's brilliance lay not only in tactics, but in understanding that an army's spirit could shatter long before its supply lines did. Medical logistics began with trained personnel. The army included physicians, herbalists, and surgeons who travelled with the baggage animals. Their tools, bronze scalpels, cautery irons, bandages, herbal mixtures, and splints, were carefully packed and restocked whenever possible. On the march, medics treated blisters, infections, and fevers. During battles, they formed mobile stations where wounded men were carried by comrades or slaves. Alexander set a cultural tone. Medical care was honourable, not shameful, and a wounded soldier was never abandoned. This alone saved countless lives. Water safety mattered as much as surgical skill. Polluted wells could wipe out entire companies. Scouts tested water sources before the soldiers drank. If water was questionable, it was boiled, filtered through cloth, or mixed with wine to kill bacteria. A surprisingly effective ancient method. In deserts, dehydration became the enemy. Alexander famously poured out a helmet of offered water in front of his troops, showing he would not drink what they could not share. Moments like this fueled morale more than any speech. Morale itself was a logistical resource. Alexander knew that men who believed in the cause marched further, fought harder, and endured suffering with fewer complaints. He cultivated loyalty deliberately, sharing meals with common soldiers, fighting at the front, honouring the dead by name, and distributing spoils generously. After victories, he held games, feasts, and religious ceremonies to remind the army that their suffering had purpose. Rotations were another quiet tool. Alexander allowed units to rest, repair gear, and recover when others took the lead. In winter, he often paused large operations entirely, sheltering the army in cities or fertile lands where food and warmth were abundant. These breaks prevented burnout, something many ancient commanders overlooked. Exhaustion was always lurking. Heat stroke, frostbite, dysentery, and infections killed more soldiers than swords. But Alexander minimized losses by caring for his men as the true assets of the campaign. Logistics wasn't only about moving supplies. It was about maintaining the human core of the army, a force that followed him not out of fear, but belief. Alexander's empire in motion could not function without communication. 40,000 men spread across miles of marching columns, supply trains, scouting parties, and engineering units needed a continuous stream of orders, clear, fast, and reliable. In an age with no radios, no written dispatches carried by vehicles, and no long-distance signalling devices beyond flags and fire beacons, this challenge was immense. Yet Alexander managed it with a system so effective that his army moved like a single organism. The core of the communication network consisted of messengers, mounted couriers trained to navigate rough terrain at speed. These riders carried verbal or written orders from Alexander to his commanders, from commanders to officers, and from officers to the men. Their horses were the fastest in the army, and fresh mounts waited at intervals along major routes whenever Alexander anticipated intense activity. A courier could travel dozens of kilometers in a day, allowing Alexander to redirect entire units in hours rather than days. Inside the marching column, coordination depended on discipline and structure. The army moved in organized blocks: heavy infantry, cavalry, light troops, siege engineers, and baggage trains, each knowing its place and responsibilities. Officers used horn blasts, drums, and shouted commands to control the pace and spacing. A single change in formation required hundreds of men to shift simultaneously. Yet because of rigorous training, maneuvers happened smoothly, even on narrow roads or uneven terrain. Before every major movement or battle, Alexander held councils with his generals. These meetings were not ceremonial, they were tactical briefings. Alexander outlined objectives, explained terrain, and assigned roles. His commanders could ask questions, raise concerns, and suggest alternatives. By the time the council ended, every senior officer understood the plan in detail, crucial for an army that often marched or fought far from its leader's direct line of sight. Communication extended beyond the army itself. Alexander cultivated a network of informants, diplomats, and friendly local rulers who relayed intelligence on enemy movements. Envoys carried messages between conquered cities, ensuring smooth transitions and reliable regional governance. Even during rapid advances, Alexander left behind functioning administrative structures capable of maintaining supplies, order, and loyalty. Coordination wasn't merely military, it was logistical. When the army needed to pivot suddenly, communication ensured that scouts moved first, supply trains rerouted, engineers adjusted their tasks, and baggage animals shifted formation. Without this synchronization, the army would have splintered into chaos. What made Alexander's logistical genius astonishing wasn't just that he supplied his army, but that he kept every part of it moving together. Orders flowed like blood through arteries, never stopping, never slowing, ensuring that his war machine marched with unity, precision, and purpose. For nearly a decade, Alexander's logistical system held together under pressures that would have shattered any ordinary army. It fed men across scorching deserts, moved siege equipment over mountains, supplied war horses across barren plains, and coordinated thousands of moving parts with razor-sharp precision. But even the greatest logistical machinery has limits, and by the final years of the campaign, Alexander began to confront them. The first cracks appeared in India. The monsoon rains turned roads into rivers. Grain rotted before it could be cooked. Baggage animals sank into mud so deep that entire carts disappeared. Scouts struggled to find reliable landmarks in a landscape transformed by storms. Even seasoned commanders admitted they had never seen terrain so hostile to movement. Every kilometre forward felt like a negotiation with nature. Then came the emotional strain. The army had marched for years, far longer than any soldier had expected. Homesickness became its own logistical threat. Rumours spread that the edge of the world lay ahead, that monsters lived in the eastern forests, that no returning path existed. When Alexander demanded they press deeper into India, his men refused. Not out of cowardice, but because logistics, physical and psychological, had reached breaking point. Food was unreliable, weather was punishing, and morale was dangerously thin. The retreat through the Gedrosian desert was the final blow. Alexander attempted to march his army along a coastal route so remote and barren that even local tribes avoided it. Water was almost non-existent. Wells were scattered and often dry. Heat killed faster than enemy blades. Baggage animals collapsed. Supplies had to be rationed to handfuls. Men marched delirious, leaving behind comrades who could no longer stand. No tactical genius could outrun thirst. This wasn't failure of planning. It was the brutal reality that some environments simply could not support tens of thousands of people, moving as one. Logistics, the foundation of Alexander's conquests, had finally met a battlefield it could not win. Yet even in these hardships, the system held long enough to save the army from total annihilation. Scouts still searched for water. Remaining supply ships shadowed the coast, dropping off what little they could. Officers kept order. Alexander shared his men's suffering, refusing special treatment. That alone kept the army from dissolving entirely. By the time the shattered force reached safety, the lesson was clear. Alexander had pushed logistics to its limits, and beyond his campaigns were not just a triumph of strategy, but a testament to how far planning, discipline, and relentless willpower could carry a civilization across the unknown. And in the end, it was logistics, not swords, that drew the final boundary of his empire. The Subura did not welcome you gently. It hit you, in the nose, in the ears, in the chest, with a wave of noise, smoke, heat, and humanity so dense it felt like stepping into another universe entirely. Only a few steps separated it from the respectable districts of Rome, yet the contrast was so sharp it might as well have been a different city. Behind you lay marble temples and orderly streets. Ahead sprawled a chaotic maze of taverns, brothels, workshops, and towering insular tenements leaning over the streets like crooked giants. The first thing anyone noticed was the sound. Subura never slept. Even at dawn, the streets throbbed with shouted arguments, clattering carts, children chasing each other through alleys, and prostitutes calling out from balconies. Vendors hollered prices for bread, olives, lamp oil, and boiled sausages. Smiths hammered metal in doorways. Beggars sang or cried for coins. And somewhere above it all, laundry lines stretched between windows like makeshift banners, swaying in the warm Roman breeze. Smells layered on top of each other. Wood smoke, fish stew, spilled wine, sweat from hundreds of labourers, wet clay from potters' workshops, and the unmistakable stench rising from gutters that doubled as sewers. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive. Subura was the beating heart of Rome's working class, a district where life was loud, fast, and constantly on the edge of disorder. The buildings rose high, often 5 or 6 stories, built cheaply by landlords who cared more about rent than safety. Fires were common, collapses even more so. Families squeezed into tiny rooms lit by a single oil lamp. Freedmen, immigrants, craftsmen, gladiators, prostitutes, and criminals all lived wall to wall, layered above shops and taverns that never closed. You could buy anything in Subura: food, sex, stolen goods, gossip, forged documents, protection, or trouble you hadn't meant to find. Then there were the streets themselves, narrow, twisting, half hidden by shadows. They felt like they were watching you. Stray dogs darted between legs. Thieves moved like ghosts. Drunks slept in doorways while debt collectors stalked the alleys like predatory cats. Every corner whispered a rumour or held a secret. To the elite, Subura was Rome's shame. To the poor, it was home. To travellers, it was overwhelming. But to Rome itself, it was essential. A place where the empire's labourers lived, where its gossip was born, and where its pulse beat loudest. Entering Subura meant entering Rome's raw truth. If the Subura had temples, they weren't built of marble. They were built of cheap wood, cracked clay, and smoke-blackened beams. These temples were taverns, the true gathering places of the district. Drinking houses stood on every corner, squeezed between workshops and brothels, glowing with lamplight day and night. They were always full, always loud, always trouble waiting to happen. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. Smoke from oil lamps mixed with steam rising from boiling pots of stew, and the sour reek of old wine soaked into wooden walls. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, shouting over one another, slamming clay cups, laughing, arguing, flirting or plotting. A tavern in the Subura wasn't just a place to drink. It was a marketplace of stories, rumours, insults, and opportunities. Cheap wine flowed constantly, watered down but served in endless clay cups. Stronger stuff, imported from the provinces, unofficially, was available if you knew who to pay. Bread dipped in garlic oil, bowls of lentils, sausages sizzling on iron pans, and fried fish from the Tiber were the standard fare. Food wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to keep labourers standing for another day of hard work. The tavern owners knew their clientele well. Posts were driven into the bar to chain drunk troublemakers. Bodyguards lounged near the entrance, ready to throw out thieves pretending to be customers. Prostitutes drifted from table to table, offering a smile, a conversation, or far more if the price was right. Gamblers tossed knucklebones in the corners, gathering small crowds as arguments flared over every dice roll. Above all, the tavern was Rome's gossip furnace. News travelled faster here than in the Senate. If a politician had embarrassed himself, Subura knew. If a gladiator had refused to fight, Subura whispered about it. If a wealthy merchant's daughter had run off, Subura had the details within hours. Drunken speech loosened secrets, and the tavern keepers remembered everything. Fights broke out often, sometimes from insults, sometimes from pickpockets caught in the act, sometimes simply because someone had one cup too many. But violence was almost routine here. The crowd parted, the fists flew, and then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Someone bought wine to restore peace, and life flowed on. In Subura, taverns weren't distractions. They were the soundtrack of the district. Noisy, smoky, crowded places where Rome's working class laughed, bled, schemed, and survived. When the sun dipped behind Rome's hills, the Subura didn't quiet down. It sharpened. The night brought a new kind of energy, thicker and more dangerous than the daytime chaos. Oil lamps flickered to life, throwing long shadows across crooked streets. From behind painted doorways and beaded curtains came the soft murmurs and bright laughter of Rome's most infamous profession, the brothels of the Subura. Brothels came in every form. Some were little more than a single room behind a tavern, where a mattress on the floor and a curtain for privacy passed as comfort. Others were multi-room establishments run by experienced leni, madams who knew how to handle clients, bribe guards, keep peace between rival pimps, and squeeze money from customers who claimed they were broke. The wealthiest brothels offered mosaics on the walls, perfumes in clay jars, and women or men dressed in fine linen. But even these luxury houses remained firmly Suburan, loud, smoky, passionate, and always slightly dangerous. The sex workers of Subura were a diverse mix. Some were slaves working off debts or fulfilling the orders of their owners. Others were freedwomen or freedmen who had chosen the trade because it offered more coins than weaving, hauling, or street selling. A few were runaways, fugitives, or people whose families had abandoned them to survive as they could. They came from Greece, Syria, Egypt, Gaul, and every corner of the empire. Subura was a melting pot of languages, accents, desires, and desperation. Their windows had little painted signs, sandals for women, phalluses for men, masks for variety shows, and lamp symbols indicating rooms available. Patrons lined up in the corridors, coins in hand, bargaining loudly. Inside, the mood was unpredictable. Sometimes playful, sometimes melancholy, sometimes brutal. The madams enforced rules to keep fights from erupting, but in a district like Subura, trouble never stayed quiet for long. And yet, brothels were not only places of lust, they were centres of information. Soldiers bragged about upcoming deployments. Merchants whispered about shady deals. Politicians' henchmen sought discretion and sometimes offered bribes or secrets. A single evening could expose a rumour worth a fortune. Prostitutes listened and remembered their knowledge made them valuable, protected, and occasionally feared. Walking past the brothels meant passing throbbing music, muffled arguments, sudden laughter, and shadows that moved faster than the lamplight. Subura's night economy wasn't hidden. It was the district's lifeblood, pulsing openly through the streets. Here, vice wasn't shameful. It was business. It was survival. It was Subura. If daylight showed Subura's noise and poverty, nighttime revealed its teeth. Crime wasn't a lurking force here. It walked openly, breathed the same smoke-filled air, and moved through every alley with practiced ease. Subura was notorious across Rome for its thieves, gangs, and shadow networks, so deeply rooted that even the city guard entered reluctantly, and only in groups the thieves came first. Pickpockets slipped through crowds like fish darting through reeds. Children often learned the craft before they learned letters. They tugged at belts, slipped hands into coin purses, or sliced open bags with tiny knives. The smarter ones didn't steal boldly. They created distractions, a staged argument, a sudden fall, a spilled basket of fruit. While all eyes turned, a purse vanished. Losing money in Sabura wasn't a rare misfortune. It was expected. Then there were the burglars. At night, they moved across rooftops, creeping through open windows or cutting through weak shutters. Insulae were perfect targets. Dozens of residents crammed into flimsy apartments with almost no ability to secure their belongings. Burglars didn't always work alone. Many belonged to one of Sabura's gangs, loose collectives bound not by loyalty, but by profit. Gangs varied in size and reputation. Some controlled gambling dens or brothel protection rackets. Others specialized in extortion, demanding payment from tavern owners to prevent accidents. A few acted almost like unofficial neighborhood guards, helping residents in exchange for coin or shelter. But many gangs were unpredictable, prone to infighting, betrayal, and sudden violence. Their turf wars, fought with fists, clubs, or short daggers, often erupted without warning, sending bystanders scattering. The city's official security force, the urban cohorts, avoided patrolling Sabura after dark. They knew the terrain favoured locals: narrow passages, dead-end alleys, rooftop shortcuts. Criminals navigated them like second-nature officers risked ambushes, mockery, or worse. When they did enter, it was usually to retrieve a corpse, break up a riot, or escort a politician's private guard. Information was currency. Criminals traded it like merchants traded spices. Who was carrying money? Who owed debts? Who was new to the district and likely unprepared? Sabura was a district where secrets didn't remain hidden long, and where those who kept their mouths shut survived the longest. Yet for all its danger, residents adapted. They walked quickly, kept purses hidden, avoided certain alleys, and learned which faces meant trouble. Sabura didn't ask for moral judgment. It demanded awareness. In a place where criminals lived door to door with honest labourers, survival meant understanding one simple truth: the shadows ruled the streets, and the streets never slept. Beneath the noise, crime, and nightlife, Sabura had another identity. It was the engine room of Rome. This district wasn't populated only by thieves and drunkards. It was home to tens of thousands of honest labourers and craftsmen whose sweat kept the empire functioning. If Rome ate, built, manufactured, hauled, cleaned, or repaired anything, odds were good it passed through the hands of a Saburan worker. At dawn, long before taverns emptied, the labourers emerged. Men carrying baskets, ropes, bricks, clay pots, and tools filtered out of the insulae like a river of exhaustion. Porters headed toward markets and warehouses to haul sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, or crates of fish. Builders marched to construction sites, carrying chisels and mallets, ready to carve stone or mix mortar under the burning sun. Carpenters, metal workers, leather tanners, and cobblers opened their workshops, small rooms lit by a single lamp where the air smelled of sweat, burning charcoal, and raw materials. Women worked just as hard. Many spent their days washing clothes in public basins, grinding grain, weaving wool, or selling vegetables on street corners. Some cooked simple meals to sell: bowls of porridge, bread with cheese, figs, boiled chickpeas, or salted fish. Children helped, carrying water, tending fires, or shouting prices to attract customers. In Sabura, work began early and ended late, because survival didn't allow leisure. Craftsmen were the backbone of the district. The clang of blacksmiths shaping iron tools echoed down alleys. Potters kneaded clay at their doorsteps, shaping cups and storage jars that would be sold across the city. Shoemakers stitched sandals for soldiers, slaves and merchants alike. Every trade existed here, from barbers shaving faces in the street to scribes writing legal contracts for those who could afford literacy. Despite the chaos around them, labourers supported each other. Neighbours shared food when someone fell ill. Women watched one another's children. Water carriers offered a drink to exhausted workers for a single coin. It wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Life in Sabura was too hard to face alone. Money stretched thin. Most residents lived from one wage to the next, constantly battling hunger, rent, illness, and overcrowding. But what Subura lacked in comfort, it made up for in resilience. Every face told a story of survival. Every workshop spoke of skill. Every dawn revealed a district that, despite its vice and violence, kept Rome fed, clothed, and moving. Subura wasn't pretty. But it worked, and Rome worked because of it. If the streets of Subura were chaotic, the buildings towering above them were worse. The insulae, Rome's infamous tenement blocks, loomed over the district like crooked giants, stacked floor upon floor, rising 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. They leaned at odd angles, creaked in the wind, and swayed under the weight of hundreds of residents. These weren't homes built with care. They were investments built with speed. Landlords wanted rent, not longevity, and the result was some of the most dangerous living conditions in the ancient world. From the moment you stepped inside an insula, you felt the pressure of life compressed into too little space. The ground floor usually housed workshops or taverns, filling the air with smoke, steam, and constant noise. Above them, narrow staircases spiraled upward, steep, uneven, and dark, even during daylight. Most residents carried a small oil lamp to avoid missteps, because one slip on those stairs could mean a broken leg, or worse. Rooms were tiny, often no more than a single cramped chamber for entire families. Furniture was minimal: a straw mattress, a wooden stool, a few clay bowls, maybe a curtain for privacy if someone was lucky. Kitchens were rare. Residents cooked with small braziers, which filled rooms with smoke and made fire a constant threat. A single spark could climb an entire building in minutes, turning an insula into a deadly inferno. Water was another struggle. Only the wealthier insulae had access to aqueduct-fed fountains in their courtyards. Most residents carried buckets up and down several flights every day, navigating crowded stairwells while trying not to spill their precious supply. Night brought another challenge: darkness. Lamps were expensive, oil even more so. Many families sat in near blackness after sunset, conserving what little they had. Noise travelled through the walls like they didn't exist. Arguments, crying babies, drunken songs from downstairs taverns, and footsteps from people constantly coming and going. Subura's insulae never knew silence. Privacy was a luxury few could imagine. And yet, despite it all, these vertical slums pulsed with community. Neighbours shared food, watched children, exchanged gossip, and protected each other from thieves. They lived stacked in layers, like the strata of Rome's struggling class: freedmen, immigrants, manual labourers, widows, runaway slaves, and the wandering poor. Dangerous, overcrowded, unstable. The insulae were the harsh reality behind Rome's gleaming marble. In Subura, life didn't just happen in the streets. It happened above them, in rickety towers where survival meant adapting to a world built upward instead of outward. If Subura had a pulse, it beat strongest in its street markets. From sunrise until long past dusk, the district transformed into a living marketplace. Chaotic, loud, irresistible. Every alleyway, courtyard, and open patch of dirt became a trading floor, where coins changed hands as fast as insults. Subura didn't have the polished, marble-columned markets of the Forum. It had mud, sweat, bargaining, and survival. Vendors arrived before dawn, dragging carts or carrying baskets hanging from yokes across their shoulders. They staked out their spots with practiced aggression, arguing over inches of space. By the time sunlight touched the rooftops, the smell of the district had already changed. Roasted nuts, boiling lentils, salted fish, grilling sausages, and onions sizzling in oil. Hungry labourers crowded around food stalls, eating on their feet before heading to work. Food was cheap, simple, and filling. Bakers sold flatbreads warm from clay ovens. Fishmongers displayed their morning catch on wooden planks drenched with water, attracting cats and desperate children alike. Greengrocers shouted prices for olives, leeks, chickpeas, and figs. Women sold porridge ladled into clay bowls for a single coin. A few lucky vendors offered luxuries, honey cakes, dates from Syria, or spiced wine. But these were rare treats for special days beyond food. Sabura's streets were crammed with traders, selling almost anything a Roman might need. Leatherworkers laid out sandals and belts. Tinkers displayed bronze pans, pots, and repair tools. Barbers set up stools right on the street, shaving customers while gossip flowed around them. Fortune-tellers read palms beside herbalists selling remedies for headaches, fevers, or broken hearts. Performers, jugglers, flute players, snake handlers drew crowds that blocked entire walkways. Noise was constant. Vendors shouted in Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Egyptian dialects. Buyers argued fiercely to knock a coin off the price. Children darted between legs, dogs barked, chickens escaped cages. Somewhere in the frenzy, a thief always made his move. Markets were easy hunting grounds for skilled fingers, but Sabura's street markets were more than commerce. They were the district's social arena. Women traded news as they bought vegetables. Men debated gladiator results over cups of spiced wine. Passing soldiers flirted with stall keepers. Gossip flowed as freely as smoke from cooking fires. If something happened in Rome, a scandal, a death, a political uproar, the Subura markets knew first. And they spread the news faster than any herald. In these crowded streets, survival was an art. Selling, buying, bargaining, all required instinct and resilience. The market wasn't just where Saburans fed their families. It was where they lived their lives, minute by minute, noisy, smoky, unforgettable minute. No district in Rome lived closer to disaster than Subura. It was a place where danger didn't need an invader or a rebellion. It could spark from a kitchen fire, a drunken argument, or a simple misunderstanding in a crowded alley. And when disaster struck here, it struck hard. Subura was famous across the empire for three things: fires, riots, and a deep mutual distrust between its people and the officials meant to control them. Fires were the oldest enemy. Insulae built from cheap timber and dry plaster turned into tinderboxes during the hot months. A single overturned oil lamp or cooking brazier could ignite an entire building. Flames climbed the wooden stairways like ladders, spreading from apartment to apartment in minutes. Smoke filled the narrow streets long before residents realized they were trapped. Neighbors burst into each other's rooms, grabbing children, hauling elderly tenants down collapsing staircases. Fire didn't discriminate. It devoured everything. Subura had no organized firefighting force. Buckets, wet cloths, and desperate shouts were the only weapons. Sometimes the urban cohorts arrived with axes to tear down burning walls, but more often the fire had already taken half the block people rebuilt, again and again, because they had no other place to go. Riots were just as common. Crowded living, poverty, hunger, crime, and constant stress made Subura a boiling pot. If a landlord raised rent, a fight broke out. If a corrupt official demanded bribes, crowds gathered with stones. If two gangs argued over territory, the entire street turned into a battleground. Wine-fueled tavern brawls spilled into alleys. In festival seasons, excitement turned chaotic. Torches, drums, and drunken shouts often pushed crowds past the point of control. The city authorities feared Subura. Urban cohorts patrolled rarely, and always in groups. Politicians ordered their guards to avoid certain streets altogether. Entering Subura unprotected was seen as foolish, even for hardened soldiers. The residents didn't trust the authorities either. They saw them as outsiders, tax collectors, enforcers of rules that didn't consider daily struggle. Subura handled its own justice. Thieves were beaten by neighbors. Troublemakers were chased out. Gangs negotiated truces without involving law enforcement. And yet, in moments of disaster, unity appeared instantly. When a wall collapsed, dozens helped dig survivors out. When riot turned truly deadly, neighbors shielded children and strangers alike. Subura was volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it was also fiercely protective of its own. Here, survival wasn't a hobby, it was a community instinct, forged in fire, fear, and resilience. For all its grime, danger, and endless noise, Subura had something the polished districts of Rome lacked: a soul. It wasn't a district built on marble pride or aristocratic ceremony. It was built on human energy, raw, unfiltered, relentless. Subura was where Rome's heart beat at street level, where the empire's poorest and boldest carved out a life in the cracks of the city culture thrived here, not in libraries or lecture halls, but in daily life. Storytelling happened in taverns over cheap wine, where old men recounted gladiator fights, love affairs gone wrong, and rumours of imperial scandals whispered by drunken soldiers. Music drifted from upper floors, flutes, drums, or improvised instruments beaten on clay pots. Children danced barefoot in alleys, chasing each other through shadows illuminated by oil lamps. Languages mixed constantly. Latin blended with Greek, Aramaic, Punic, Egyptian dialects, and the rough accents of Gaul and Thrace. In a single marketplace, you could hear 10 different regions of the empire represented in a single argument. Subura wasn't diverse because Rome wanted it that way. It was diverse because Rome absorbed the world, and the world flowed downhill into its cheapest district. Religion was equally vibrant. Street shrines stood beside doorways. Tiny statues of Lares, household gods, watched over families struggling to get by. Women lit incense in cracked clay bowls. Men left coins or bread scraps at makeshift altars. Foreign cults had footholds too. Syrian, Egyptian, Jewish, Mithraic Subura accepted any god who accepted its people. Faith was not ritual here. It was survival. Despite its reputation, Subura also produced talent. Actors, boxers, gladiators, fortune-tellers, healers, midwives, craftsmen, cooks, musicians. Many of Rome's most colourful personalities came from these tangled streets. Some rose to fame. Some rose to infamy. Most simply lived, unnoticed but essential, supporting the vast machinery of the empire from below. Identity in Subura wasn't about ancestry or wealth. It was about toughness, street instinct, community, knowing where not to walk after dark, knowing who to greet and who to avoid, knowing how to stretch a coin until the next payday. Families who survived generations here developed a fierce pride. Suburanus became more than an address. It became a personality. Rome's elite dismissed Subura as a pit of vice. But if the district vanished, Rome would collapse. Its workers built the city's monuments, fed its markets, carried its burdens, and whispered the rumours that kept its politics alive. Subura was chaotic, dangerous, and exhausting, yet completely irreplaceable. In its noise and shadows lived the true pulse of Rome.